The sun over the New Mexico territory was a malevolent god in the summer of 1883. It baked the land until the red earth cracked into a web of fissures, each one a thirsty mouth gaping at a bone-white sky. Wade Ashford felt the heat through the worn leather of his saddle, a constant, oppressive weight that mirrored the one settled deep in his gut. His horse, Apollo, moved with a listless gait, kicking up clouds of fine dust that coated Wade's throat and settled in the lines around his eyes. He rode past what was once a creek, now just a meandering scar of bleached stones and brittle, yellowed weeds. The cattle he passed were walking skeletons, their ribs stark beneath loose hides, their heads hanging low as they milled around the nearly dry Ashford well. It was the heart of the ranch, and its pulse was growing faint. The rhythmic squeak and clank of the windmill pump sounded like a death rattle in the vast, aching silence of the plains. The day at the Mesquite Ford market had been a failure. The prices offered for his gaunt longhorns were an insult, barely enough to cover the cost of driving them to town. He had refused, his pride a bitter taste on his tongue, and had driven them back to starve on his own land. It was a choice between a swift death and a slow one, and he wasn't sure he'd made the right call. As he neared the ranch house, a squat, solid structure of adobe and timber built by his father's own hands, he saw a buggy parked in the meager shade of the porch. It was too sleek, too black, its polished leather gleaming with an unnatural shine in this world of dust and sweat. A man stood by the porch rail, fanning himself with his hat. Royce Harlan. The sight of him turned the frustration in Wade's stomach to a cold, hard knot. Wade swung down from Apollo, the motion stiff with fatigue. He didn't bother to tether the horse. The animal had no energy to wander. He just slapped its flank gently, sending it shuffling toward the water trough. Royce Harlan smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of his thin lips. He was a man who thrived in the cool, dim confines of his bank, a place where fortunes were undone with the scratch of a pen. Out here, in the brutal honesty of the sun, he looked like a crow dressed in a fine suit. "Ashford," Harlan said, his voice smooth as a river stone. "A difficult day at market, I hear." Wade pulled off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to knock off the worst of the dust. He did not offer a greeting. "What do you want?" Harlan. "Business, as always. The 60-day note on your loan comes due tomorrow. I trust you have the interest payment." Harlan's eyes flickered toward the skeletal cattle, a glint of satisfaction in their depths. He knew as well as Wade did that the ranch had no cash. It had nothing but dust and debt. "You know I don't," Wade said. His voice was flat, devoid of the anger simmering beneath the surface. Showing weakness to this man was like showing a wound to a wolf. "A pity," Harlan sighed, the picture of feigned sympathy. "The First Bank of Mesquite Ford must protect its investments. I'm afraid foreclosure proceedings will have to begin." Wade's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had expected this. He had dreaded it for months, watching the sky for rain that never came, watching his herd shrink, watching his father's dream bake away to nothing. There has to be another way. Harlan put his hat back on, adjusting the brim with meticulous care. The county grazing board met this morning. We were discussing the renewal of the public land leases. A great deal of concern was expressed about the moral character of certain leaseholders. A large ranch, you see, is a cornerstone of the community. It requires a steady hand, a family man at the helm, not a solitary bachelor. The words were chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Wade felt a hot flush of rage creep up his neck. "What in God's name are you talking about?" "The board has instituted a new provision, a virtue clause, if you will. To secure the renewal of your grazing rights, the primary leaseholder must be a married man, living in a state of respectable domesticity. It shows stability. It shows commitment to the community's values." He let the words hang in the hot, still air. "I managed to secure you an extension, a grace period. You have 60 days, Wade, 60 days to pay the interest and to take a wife, a respectable, decent wife. Wade stared, disbelief warring with fury. It was ludicrous. It was a trap, and the steel jaws were closing around him. Harlan and his cronies on the board had concocted this. It was a land grab, pure and simple, dressed up in the sanctimonious clothes of public morality. "You can't be serious," Wade finally managed, his voice a low growl. "I am as serious as a foreclosure notice," Harlan said smoothly. "Find yourself a good, tamed woman from a decent family. Settle down, the board will be satisfied. The bank will be satisfied, and you will keep your land. It's a simple solution. The alternative." He gestured vaguely at the parched landscape. "The alternative is this all becomes bank property." He walked to his buggy, his boots making soft, confident sounds in the dust. 60 days. Ashford. The clock is ticking. Wade stood motionless as the buggy disappeared in a cloud of its own red dust, leaving him alone with the dying land and the impossible demand. A wife, a respectable wife. The women he knew in Mesquite Ford were churchgoers and gossips, their hands soft, their judgments hard. The thought of hitching himself to one of them felt like a different kind of death. His mind flashed back, unbidden, to the market that morning. Amid the chaos of livestock and merchants, a freight wagon's horse had spooked, its eyes rolling in terror as it reared, threatening to bring its heavy hooves down on a small girl who had frozen in its path. Screams had erupted from the crowd. Men had shouted, frozen in place. But from the edge of the commotion, a figure had moved with fluid speed. It was a woman, or rather a girl who was nearly a woman, dressed not in a calico dress but in durable canvas trousers and a man's shirt. She hadn't screamed. She had vaulted over a water barrel, her movements economical and sure. She'd grabbed the horse's bridle with one hand and with the other. She had spoken to it, a low, firm murmur that somehow cut through the panic. The horse, still trembling, had quieted, its ears twitching toward her voice. She had led it away from the child and handed the reins to the stunned driver. The girl's father, a portly merchant, had rushed forward, scooping up his daughter and then fumbling in his pocket for a coin, offering it with effusive thanks. The rescuer had just shaken her head. "Don't need payment for doing what's right," she'd said, her voice clear but clipped. She had a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and her dark hair was a wild braid down her back. A hunting knife was sheathed at her belt. Wade had watched as she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving a wake of whispers behind her. "The McCrae girl," someone had muttered nearby. "Wild as a coyote, lives out in the canyons. Ought to be in a dress." Isla McCrae, Izzy, they called her. He knew of her. Everyone did. She was a fixture at the edge of town, a creature of the wilderness who came and went as she pleased, trading pelts and herbs for what she needed. She was the very opposite of the respectable, decent woman Harlan had described. Wade walked over to the well, the wood of the structure warm and splintery beneath his palm. He stared down into the darkness, at the distant, murky gleam of the water. It was so low he could barely see it. The well was failing. The ranch was failing, and his pride, his fierce independence, was a useless currency against the calculated greed of men like Royce Harlan. The screen door of the house creaked open, and Tia Rosa emerged. She was a small, round woman whose face was a map of kindness and sorrow. She had been the ranch's cook in heart since before Wade was born. She held a biscuit in her hand, offering it to him without a word. He took it. It was hard and dry, made from their dwindling supply of flour. He broke it in half, the sound a brittle snap. He put a piece in his mouth, the dry crumbs a testament to their shared hardship. It tasted of survival. "He is a devil, that one," Tia Rosa said softly, her dark eyes on the road where Harlan's buggy had vanished. Wade just nodded, chewing the dry biscuit, a tamed bride. The words echoed in his head, mocking him. He looked out at the empty saddle rack by the barn, a long pole where the saddles of a dozen ranch hands should have been hanging. He'd had to let them all go, one by one. Now it was just him, Tia Rosa, the old blacksmith Zeke Holt, and the boy. Tomas, an old woman, an old man, a boy, and him against a drought in a bank. Later, as twilight bled purple and orange across the horizon, Wade found himself in town. He didn't know why he'd come. He couldn't afford a drink at the saloon. He just needed to be around people, to escape the suffocating silence of his own failing land. He was standing in front of the livery when a gentle voice spoke his name. "Wade, a heavy burden you're carrying, my son." It was Reverend Jonah, a kind man with a face as earnest and weathered as an old Bible. He stood there, his hands clasped, his expression full of genuine concern. "Reverend," Wade acknowledged, touching the brim of his hat. "I heard about the trouble at the market, and I heard Royce Harlan paid you a visit," the Reverend said, lowering his voice. "The whole town is talking about this new condition, this marriage clause. It is an uncharitable thing." Wade gave a short, humorless laugh. "Uncharitable is one word for it." The Reverend laid a hand on Wade's arm. "Son, perhaps it is providence. Perhaps it is time you found a helpmeet, a good woman to stand by your side. A home needs a woman's touch. A man needs a wife's comfort. It is God's own design." Wade remained silent, his jaw tight. "There are good, godly women in our congregation," Reverend Jonah continued, his voice earnest. "Think of Abigail Parris, the deacon's daughter, a fine, pious girl, an excellent baker. She would make a wonderful wife for a man like you. She is quiet and gentle of spirit." Quiet, gentle, tamed. The words sounded like a cage as the Reverend spoke. Wade's mind was not on Abigail Parris and her pious baking. He was seeing a flash of canvas trousers and a wild braid of dark hair. He was seeing steady hands on a spooked horse, a level gaze that asked for nothing and offered no apologies. He was seeing the knife at Isla McCrae's belt. Harlan wanted him to find a respectable bride to satisfy a corrupt board. The world wanted him to find a gentle woman to fit a prescribed role. But as he stood there in the gathering dusk, the dust of his dying ranch still on his boots, a different thought took root in Wade Ashford's mind. A desperate, wild, and wholly unsuitable idea. He thought that the kind of woman who could survive out here, the kind of partner he actually needed to fight a drought and a devil like Harlan, wasn't quiet or gentle at all. She was something else entirely. She was something wild. The old Dos Hermanas water station was little more than a ruin, a collection of sun-bleached timbers and a stone well that had been dry for a decade. It was a place of ghosts and wind, which was why Isla McCrae favored it. People left it alone. She was checking the edge on her skinning knife when the sound of a lone horse approached, slow and deliberate. She did not look up, but her hand rested on the hilt of the knife. Her body tensed. She knew the rhythm of every rider in the territory, and this one was unfamiliar, yet confident. Wade Ashford dismounted, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He stopped a respectful distance away, watching her for a moment. The sun caught the glint of steel as she honed the blade with a whetstone, her movements practiced and efficient. "Miss McCrae," he said. His voice was low, rough with dust. She finished a long, smooth stroke with the stone, then finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no welcome. "Ashford, you are a long way from your thirsty cows." He ignored the barb. There was no room for pride in what he had come to do. "I have a proposition for you. A business arrangement." She laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. She sheathed her knife. "I do not do business with cattle barons. Your kind of business usually ends with a new fence and one less waterhole for everyone else." "This is different," he said, stepping closer. The air between them felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. "I need a wife." Izzy stared at him as if he had grown a second head. Then her expression hardened into pure, undiluted scorn. "Then go to the church. I hear the deacon has a daughter for sale. She can bake biscuits and faint on command. I can put a bullet in a coyote's eye at 200 yards and I do not faint. I know what you can do, Wade said. His voice quiet but intense. I saw you at the market. You did not hesitate. That was a child and a horse. This is you. I find I am hesitating a great deal. She crossed her arms, her posture a wall of defiance. What madness has possessed you, Ashford? Did the sun cook your brain, you and I mixing would be like mixing fire and gunpowder. I need to be married to keep my land, he said, laying the ugly truth bare. Royce Harlan and the county board have seen to that. It is a contract, a piece of paper to satisfy them. I need a wife for 60 days. After that, we can have it annulled. You would be free, and I would pay you $500. It was an enormous sum, more money than she had ever seen in one place. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold fire. She walked right up to him, so close he could see the flecks of brown in her gray eyes. You think you can buy me? She whispered, her voice dangerously soft. You think you can put a ring on my finger and parade me in front of your banker like a prize heifer? I am not some collar to make you please the fancy suits. Ashford, I am not a pet to be tamed. My life is my own. It is not for sale. She turned her back on him. Go find your quiet, gentle girl. Leave me be. Wade stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the derelict timbers. He had been a fool to think it could be so simple. He mounted Apollo and rode away, the weight of his failure heavier than ever. 2 weeks later, the situation grew more desperate. Wade, Zeke, and young Tomas were moving the last of their strong breeding stock to a hidden canyon pasture where a small spring still trickled. It was a slow, grueling process, the cattle lowing miserably, the sun relentless. They were in a narrow pass when the riders appeared, materializing from the rocks on either side like vengeful spirits. There were 5 of them, their faces covered by bandanas. Caleb Dorn was in the lead, a big, brutal man with a reputation for violence. Well now, Ashford, Dorn drawled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Moving some of your herd, do not let us stop you. Wade's hand went to his own pistol. This is Ashford land. Dorn, ride on. Dorn chuckled. Not for long, from what I hear. The next moments were a blur of dust and shouting. Gunfire exploded in the tight confines of the pass. Zeke, riding on the flank, yelled as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of his arm, sending him tumbling from his horse. The cattle, already on edge, panicked and stampeded back the way they had come. Wade fired back, trying to give Tomas cover as the boy scrambled behind a boulder. But it was over in seconds. The rustlers rounded up 6 of his best heifers and drove them off, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. By the time Wade got to Zeke, the old man was sitting up, cursing a blue streak and clutching his bleeding arm. The wound was not serious, but it was a violation, a clear and brutal message. Deputy Nora Briggs rode out to the ranch that afternoon. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman with intelligent eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. She examined the scene of the attack, her gaze missing nothing. This was clean, she said, looking at the hoof prints. Too clean. They knew exactly where you would be and when. She looked at Wade. Dorn is a thug, but he is not usually this bold unless he is getting paid well by someone who thinks they are above the law. Royce Harlan, Wade said, the name like poison in his mouth. Saying it and proving it are 2 different things, Nora replied. She went to see Zeke, who was having his arm bandaged by Tia Rosa. The old blacksmith was grumbling. That banker is a snake in the grass, Zeke muttered, wincing as Tia Rosa cleaned the wound. And snakes need a charmer, Nora said, or a shovel. Later that day, Nora walked into the first bank of Mesquite Ford. The air was cool and smelled of paper and money. Royce Harlan sat behind a large, polished desk, looking completely at ease. Deputy, he said with a thin smile, to what do I owe the pleasure? Wade Ashford lost 6 head of cattle this morning. Caleb Dorn's work. One of his men was injured. Harlan steepled his fingers. A terrible business. Rustling. A scourge on our territory. I trust you will find the culprits. Oh, I have a good idea who the culprit is, Nora said, her voice level. It is funny, is it not? How Mr. Ashford's troubles seem to multiply just when he is under pressure from this bank. Harlan's smile did not waver. Deputy Briggs, are you suggesting some connection between a legitimate financial institution and a common criminal like Caleb Dorn? That is a serious accusation. You should be careful. A woman in your position has to be twice as careful as a man. Nora's eyes narrowed. I'm always careful, Mr. Harlan, and I'm always watching. The theft of the cattle was a blow, but the drought was a war of attrition. The main well was now producing more mud than water. One afternoon, a rickety wagon pulled up to the ranch house. In it was a family, a man and a woman with 3 small, thirsty children, their faces streaked with dust. Behind them, on foot, was a small party of dine, led by the young woman Naya. The man approached Wade, his hat in his hands. Mr. Ashford, our well went dry yesterday. We heard you still had a little. We are desperate, just enough for the children. Wade looked at the pathetic trickle of water coming from the pump. He looked at the faces of the children. He looked at his own thirsty cattle. Every bucket he gave away was one less for his own survival. Tia Rosa stood on the porch, her face a mask of worry. He made his decision. Thomas, he called, work the pump. Let them fill their barrels. He turned to Naya. You and your people as well, as much as you can carry. A quiet gratitude filled the yard. For the next hour, Thomas and Wade worked the squeaking pump handle, coaxing the precious, life-giving water from the earth. They filled barrels and water skins, the sound of splashing water, a beautiful music in the dry air. Wade did not know he was being watched. From a ridge overlooking the ranch, Izzy McCrae sat on her horse, a spyglass to her eye. She had come to tell Ashford to his face to never approach her again. She had come to reinforce the wall around her heart. But what she saw stopped her. She saw the cattle baron, the man who had tried to buy her, giving away the last of his water to the poorest of his neighbors, sharing it equally with the native people the rest of the town ignored. He did it without fanfare, without asking for anything in return. It was a simple act of human decency in a world that had shown her very little of it. For the first time since he had made his ridiculous offer, she felt a flicker of something other than scorn. She remembered her mother, a woman who had trusted a man's promise, a promise that led them into an ambush where she lost her life. Her mother had been trapped by a promise. Izzy had sworn she never would be. Love and marriage were cages. Pretty cages, perhaps, but cages all the same. She looked out at the far mesas, where a herd of wild mustangs ran free against the skyline, their manes and tails streaming in the wind. That was her soul. How could she ever put it in a corral? Yet, watching Wade Ashford, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion as he gave away his ranch's lifeblood, she saw not a baron, but just a man, a stubborn, proud man trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Zeke was sitting on the porch that evening, his arm in a sling, watching Wade stare out at the parched land. You are still thinking about that wildcat, are you not? Wade did not turn. She is the only one who does not look at me with pity or contempt. Zeke grunted. She looked at you like you were something she scraped off her boot. You planning on marrying her? Or marrying that temper of hers? A small, weary smile touched Wade's lips. Comes as a set, I am afraid. The next day, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the cracked earth, Izzy rode into the Ashford yard. She did not go to the house. She stopped by the corral and waited. Wade came out of the barn, his movements slow with fatigue. He stopped when he saw her, his face wary. She did not dismount. She looked him in the eye, her gaze as steady and clear as a mountain stream. Your offer, she said, her voice even. I have thought about it. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling. stirred in Wade's chest. He waited. "I will not be tamed. Ashford," she said, her voice hard as iron, "I will not be quieted. I will not be made into some respectable little doll for your banker. If I do this, if I agree to this contract, it is on my terms." "What are your terms?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I keep my horse. I ride where I please, when I please. I keep my knife. And I keep my rifle." She paused, her eyes boring into his. "And I keep my voice. I will say what I think. And you will listen. You will treat me as a partner, not a possession. Those are my terms. No compromises." Wade looked at her, sitting astride her horse, proud and unbroken, a true daughter of this harsh, beautiful land. She was offering him a chance, but it was a chance that required him to abandon every preconceived notion he had about a wife, about marriage, about his own authority. He was the cattle baron. He was used to giving orders, to being in control. She was asking him to share that control, to meet her as an equal. Then he thought of the alternative. He saw the ranch carved up and sold, his father's legacy turned to dust. He saw Royce Harlan's smug smile. He saw a future of bitterness and regret. Then he looked at Isla McCrae again. He saw not just a solution to his problem, but a woman of incredible strength and spirit, fire and gunpowder. She had said maybe that was exactly what he needed to win this fight. For the first time in a very long time, Wade Ashford chose to bend. "All right," he said, his voice clear and firm in the evening air. "I agree to your terms." The wedding was a muted affair, held in the cool, quiet confines of the Mesquite Ford Chapel. The handful of townspeople who attended did so out of a morbid curiosity, their whispers rustling like dry leaves in the pews. Wade Ashford stood at the altar, stiff and uncomfortable in a dark suit that had seen better days. He looked less like a groom and more like a man facing a firing squad. Isla McCrae stood beside him, a stranger in a borrowed gray dress that was too plain to be festive and too formal for her spirit. Her wild hair was tamed into a severe knot at the nape of her neck, and her hands, usually so competent and sure, were clenched awkwardly at her sides. She looked like a hawk forced into a canary's cage. Royce Harlan was there, seated in the front pew, his presence a smug, silent testament to his victory. He watched the proceedings with the detached satisfaction of a man admiring his own clever handiwork. Reverend Jonah, bless his well-meaning heart, seemed to sense the profound tension in the air. When it came time for the vows, he set aside his book. He looked from Wade's stoic face to Izzy's defiant one, and his own expression softened with a wisdom that went beyond scripture. "Marriage is a partnership," he said, his voice filling the small church. "It is a shelter built by two people against the storms of the world, but a shelter without freedom is a prison. So I will not ask you to promise to obey. I will ask you to promise something more difficult and more important." He looked at Wade. "Do you, Wade Ashford, take this woman to be your partner in this life? Do you promise to honor her strength, to respect her counsel, and to protect her freedom as you would your own?" A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the proper way of things. But Wade did not hesitate. He looked at Izzy, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "I do," he said, his voice clear and steady. The Reverend then turned to Izzy. "And do you, Isla McCrae, take this man to be your partner? Do you promise to stand with him against the hardships of this land, to respect his burdens, and to protect his freedom as you would your own?" Her gaze met Wade's. For a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. This was the contract, spoken aloud in the house of God. It was her terms, given voice by a preacher. "I do," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The ride back to the Ashford Ranch was conducted in a heavy silence. The paper was signed, the vows were spoken, and the banker was satisfied. They were. In the eyes of the law and the community, man and wife, the reality of it was a strange, ill-fitting garment for them both. Tia Rosa was waiting on the porch, Her face was unreadable as she watched them dismount. She did not offer congratulations. She simply nodded and said, "Supper is ready." The meal was as quiet as the ride. Zeke and Thomas ate quickly, their eyes darting from Wade to Izzy, unsure of what to make of this new arrangement. The wind began to rise as they ate, a low moan that rattled the window panes. It was a familiar sound, the harbinger of a dust storm. After the meal, Wade pushed back his chair. "I need to check on the calves in the barn. This wind will spook them." Izzy rose as well. "I will check the well cover. If too much sand gets in, it will foul what little water is left." They went their separate ways into the growing dark. The night was moonless, the air thick with grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. Wade fought his way to the barn, the wind tearing at his clothes. Inside, the new calves were huddled together, their eyes wide with fear as the old barn timbers creaked and groaned around them. He lit a lantern, its warm, steady glow a small pocket of comfort in the roaring darkness. He hung it on a nail by the door, a tiny beacon of hope against the storm. When he finished securing the barn, he headed toward the well. He saw Izzy struggling with a heavy wooden cover, the wind threatening to rip it from her grasp. He moved to her side without a word, adding his strength to hers. Together, they managed to wrestle the cover into place and weigh it down with heavy stones. The storm was a living thing now, a shrieking demon of wind and sand. Retreating to the house felt like a defeat. They found themselves taking shelter in the lee of the adobe wall, the house at their backs, facing the storm together. The world had been reduced to the howling wind and the small, defiant circle of light cast by the lantern on the barn. Tia Rosa appeared at the door with 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed them over, her eyes lingering on them for a moment before she retreated back into the warmth of the house, leaving them alone in the maelstrom. The coffee was black, bitter, and scalding hot. They drank it in silence for a while, huddled together, the wind whipping Izzy's hair loose from its pins, lashing it across Wade's face. "My father built this place," Wade said suddenly, his voice rough against the wind. "He and my mother. They came here with nothing but 2 mules and a belief that you could make a life from this land if you were stubborn enough. He broke his back digging that well. He used to say the water was sweeter because of it." He fell silent, staring at the lantern. He would hate seeing it like this. All of it, failing. Izzy watched his profile in the flickering light, the hard lines of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. She thought of her own father, a trapper who had vanished into the mountains one winter and never returned. But it was her mother she spoke of. "My mother was not stubborn," she said, her voice so low Wade had to lean in to hear her. "She was fierce. She taught me how to read the clouds and how to find water, how to shoot. She said a woman in this land needed to know how to make her own way, because no one would make it for her." She took a sip of coffee, the bitterness a familiar comfort. She made a promise to a man once, a promise of marriage. He led her into a trap. I found her afterward. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The old, raw scar of her past was there in her voice, in the rigid set of her shoulders. It was the source of her wildness, the reason she trusted no one. Wade did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. In that moment, sharing stories of the parents who had shaped them, the ghosts of their pasts seemed to draw a little closer, not as specters, but as witnesses. They were no longer just a cattle baron and a wild girl. They were the son of a stubborn dreamer and the daughter of a fierce survivor. 2 orphans of this unforgiving land, standing together against a storm. When the wind finally began to die down hours later, they went inside. The house was cold and quiet. Wade led her to the master bedroom. It was a simple, monastic room, dominated by a large wooden bedstead. A saddle was thrown over a chair, and his hat was hung on a bedpost. There was nothing else. No curtains, no rugs, no pictures. It was a place to sleep, not to live. Izzy looked around the stark room, a flicker of wry amusement in her eyes. "You call a place home just by hanging your hat." Wade looked at the hat on the bedpost, then at her. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. "Yeah, and you hang your gun. I guess that makes us even." She unbuckled the gun belt she had put back on after the ceremony and hung it on the opposite post of the bed. The two objects, the worn felt hat and the well-oiled Colt revolver, hung like a strange coat of arms for their new, peculiar family. Wade took the spare blankets from a chest and made a bedroll for himself on the floor, leaving the bed for her. There was no argument. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the lines between them, a mark of respect for the terms of their contract. The next morning, the world was blanketed in a fine layer of red dust. As Wade and Izzy assessed the damage from the storm, they saw them. Two men on the far edge of the Ashford pasture, driving stakes into the ground. A surveyor's transit was set up beside them. Wade's exhaustion was burned away by a hot flash of rage. He strode toward them, Izzy following a few paces behind, her eyes narrowed and watchful. "What is the meaning of this?" Wade demanded as he reached the men. "This is Ashford land." The lead surveyor, a weaselly man with a stained mustache, did not look intimidated. He produced a document from his saddlebag. "We are just doing our job, Mr. Ashford. We have papers from Judge Pike's office authorizing a new survey of these grazing boundaries. A reassessment. They call it—" Wade snatched the paper. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the intent was clear. It was signed by Judge Luther Pike, a man who played cards with Royce Harlan every Tuesday night. This was another turn of the screw, an attempt to chip away at his land, to harass him into submission. He was about to tear the document in two when a loud crack, followed by a rumbling groan, echoed from the direction of the ranch house. It was the sound of stone giving way. Wade and Izzy exchanged a look of alarm and ran back toward the well. A section of the well's stone lining near the top had collapsed inward, weakened by the storm and the constant strain on the dry structure. Dust billowed from the opening, but it was not the collapse that held them transfixed. It was what the collapse had revealed. Where the stones had fallen away, a dark opening in the earth was visible, and from that opening, a small but steady stream of water trickled down the inside of the well wall. It was not a gush, but it was clear, clean water, flowing from a subterranean channel. Wade knelt, peering into the gloom. The channel was not natural. It looked like it had been deliberately packed with clay and large rocks. A crude but effective dam. The storm had shaken loose just enough of the blockage to reveal the water hidden behind it. Their drought, he realized with a sickening certainty, had not been entirely an act of God. The lifeblood of the Ashford Ranch had not just dried up. Someone had stolen it. Izzy stared at the exposed channel, at the dark, wet clay packed around the rocks. Her face, usually a mask of calm composure, was a thundercloud of fury. She looked from the blocked waterway to the parched land around them, and a lifetime of self-reliant anger hardened her eyes to flint. "I know this water," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "Its taste is different from the deep well water. It is sweeter. It comes from the high country. It flows underground through a fissure in the rock." She turned and looked toward the distant, hazy line of the mesas, "And I know where it comes out." She strode to her horse without another word, moving with a fierce, determined energy. Wade followed, his own simmering rage now sharpened by a sliver of hope. For the first time, he was not just reacting to Harlan's schemes. He had a trail to follow, a wrong to uncover. He was following her, and it felt right. She led him away from the ranch, not toward the town, but deep into the Badlands, a maze of canyons and arroyos that he had always considered impassable. She navigated the treacherous terrain with an innate certainty, her horse picking its way through the rocks as if it knew the path by heart. After an hour of riding, she dismounted at the mouth of a narrow, hidden canyon. "We walk from here," she said, pulling her rifle from its scabbard. The canyon was a secret place. cool and shaded from the relentless sun, a thin trickle of water. The same water they had seen in the well, seeped from a crack in the rock wall, nourishing a vibrant patch of green moss and ferns. It was a tiny oasis in the middle of the desert. "Naya and we have known of this place for years," Izzy said quietly. "We take only what we need." They followed the trickle of water deeper into the canyon. As they rounded a sharp bend, the sound of a much larger body of water reached them. They stopped, their eyes widening at the sight before them. A crude dam, a barrier of felled logs, rocks, and packed earth, had been constructed across the canyon floor, blocking the main flow of the underground stream. The water pooled behind it, forming a sizable reservoir. A newly dug channel, wide and deep, diverted the captured water out of the canyon and toward the east, in the direction of Royce Harlan's recently acquired properties. The theft was audacious, breathtaking in its simple, brutal greed. Harlan had not just stolen Wade's water, he had stolen the water of the land itself. Wade's hands clenched into fists. His first instinct was the primal urge to tear the dam apart with his bare hands. But Izzy laid a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly steady. "Look," she whispered, pointing. In the soft mud around the base of the dam were dozens of boot prints. They were fresh, and the heel of one of the prints had a distinctive nick in it, a small, crescent-shaped flaw in the leather. They rode back to Mesquite Ford with a grim purpose. Deputy Nora Briggs listened to their story in her small, cluttered office, her expression growing harder with every word. When Wade described the boot print, she stood and took a dusty plaster cast from a shelf. It was a perfect match to the one they had seen. "I took this from the pass after Dorn's men jumped you," she said, her voice tight with anger. "It is from one of his men, a lout named Jebediah Smith. This is the proof I need." Armed with the evidence, Wade filed a formal complaint with Judge Luther Pike. The judge, a portly man with shifting, watery eyes, listened with an air of profound boredom. Royce Harlan stood beside the judge's desk, looking on with an expression of mild amusement. Pike shuffled the papers Wade presented. "A complaint about a water diversion, Mr. Ashford, on land that is not, strictly speaking, your own. It is the source of my well water. Judge, it has been illegally blocked and diverted to Mr. Harlan's property," Wade said, struggling to keep his voice even. "Deputy Briggs has evidence that Caleb Dorn's men built the dam." Judge Pike peered at Wade over his spectacles. "Evidence? You mean a single, common boot print in some mud that is hardly conclusive. For all we know, you built this supposed dam yourself to cast suspicion on an honest businessman like Mr. Harlan." He slammed his gavel down. The sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Complaint dismissed for lack of evidence. Furthermore, Mr. Harlan has filed a countersuit. You are fined $20 for trespassing on his new reservoir site. Pay the clerk on your way out." The injustice of it was a physical blow. Wade stood there, stunned and furious, the courtroom spinning around him. Harlan gave him a small, triumphant smirk as he walked past. In that moment, Izzy saw the raw fury in Wade's eyes, the impulse to abandon the pretense of law and settle this with his fists. She saw him fight it, saw him swallow his pride and his rage. He turned, his face a mask of stone, and walked out of the courtroom. He had chosen to fight with justice, even when justice was a sham. And in that moment, her reluctant respect for him deepened into something more solid, something that felt dangerously like trust. The news of the corrupt ruling spread through the valley like a brush fire. The small ranchers and homesteaders, people who had also suffered under the drought and the bank's heavy hand, saw the injustice for what it was, an attack on all of them. That evening, a quiet solidarity began to form. The family Wade had given water to returned with a sack of potatoes. Others came with a few chickens, a jar of preserves, a bit of precious firewood. It was not much, but it was everything they had. Tia Rosa, her face set in grim determination, took charge, She organized a communal kitchen in the ranch house, stretching their meager supplies to feed everyone. Zeke, his arm still in a sling, worked with Tomas to reinforce the fences, his hammer blows ringing with defiance. Tia Rosa baked a large batch of biscuits. Using the last of their flour, they were dry and hard, survival food. But as she passed them out to the assembled group, a small but resolute army gathered in the Ashford yard. The act became a sacrament. She handed one to Wade, and then one to Izzy. It was a gesture of sharing in a time of scarcity, a symbol of their new, fragile alliance. Izzy took the biscuit, its rough texture a comfort in her hand. She was not alone anymore. She was a part of this circle, a part of this fight. As night fell, a new plan was forged, not in a courtroom, but in the shadows of the barn, a plan of quiet rebellion. "We cannot let them keep that water," Wade said to Izzy and Zeke. "We have to release it." "Dorn's men will be watching it," Zeke warned. "Harlan is not a fool." "Then we will not be fools either," Izzy said. Her eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "We will go tonight. The moon is dark. We will be ghosts." Just before midnight, Wade and Izzy rode out, their horses' hooves muffled with rags. They moved through the Badlands like shadows, Izzy leading the way with an unerring sense of direction. When they reached the canyon, they tethered their horses and crept forward on foot. A single campfire burned near the dam, silhouetting two men who sat sharing a bottle. The rest of the camp was asleep. Wade and Izzy circled around, approaching the dam from the opposite side, using the rocks and the sound of the water to cover their movements. They worked in silence, their hands finding the key logs and rocks that held the structure together. It was slow, back-breaking work, their muscles straining with the effort. Every scrape of a rock, every splash of water, sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness of the night. Once, a dog in the camp barked, and they froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the guards just yelled at the dog to be quiet, their voices thick with whiskey. Slowly, agonizingly, they loosened the dam's hold. A trickle of water became a steady flow, then a powerful current. With one final, coordinated heave, they dislodged the main keystone. The dam groaned, shuddered, and then gave way. A torrent of liberated water surged down the canyon, a roaring, triumphant sound that was the sweetest music Wade had ever heard. They were making their way back to their horses when they heard voices. Two of Dorn's men, drawn by the noise, were coming to investigate. Wade and Izzy flattened themselves behind a cluster of boulders, their guns drawn. The men passed within 10 feet of their hiding place, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. They cursed when they saw the broken dam, their anger echoing in the night. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a wild, triumphant energy. They had struck a blow. They had fought back. They arrived just before dawn to find Deputy Nora Briggs waiting for them. Her face was grim, but there was a spark of satisfaction in her eyes. "While you two were out playing in the mud, I was having a conversation with Jebediah Smith," she said. "Dorn's man?" Wade asked. "The very same. I found him drunk and bragging in the saloon about all the money he was making. Arrested him for public intoxication. He was so eager to lighten his sentence that he sang like a canary." Nora unfolded a piece of paper. "He confessed everything. Building the dam on Harlan's orders, the cattle rustling. He even told me where the stolen Ashford cattle are." She paused, letting her next words land with their full weight. "And he told me about the marriage clause. He said Harlan bragged to Dorn about it. It was Harlan's own idea, written into the county charter specifically to force you out. Wade, the whole scheme was designed to take your land. I have his signed confession right here." The fragile hope born from Jebediah Smith's confession was scoured from the earth in less than a day. The victory felt hollow, the air itself turning against them. A strange, unnatural stillness fell over the territory that afternoon, the sun glaring down from a sky that had taken on a bruised, yellowish-green tint. The air grew thick, heavy, and tasted of copper. "A storm is coming," Tia Rosa said, her voice low as she stood on the porch, staring at the horizon. A bad one. The sky has the devil's color. There was no wind, no warning other than the eerie light and the oppressive silence. The cattle sensed it, milling restlessly in the main pasture, their lowing edged with a nervous energy. Wade, Zeke, and Thomas worked quickly, securing what they could, while Izzy rode the perimeter, her eyes constantly scanning the unnatural sky. The trickle of water they had freed now seemed like a cruel joke from a malevolent god who had decided to give them a different kind of water, a flood of sand. Night fell not with a gentle fade to black, but as if a heavy, dusty curtain had been dropped on the world. And with the darkness came the wind. It did not rise gradually. It struck the ranch with the force of a physical blow, a single, violent gust that ripped a shutter from its hinges and sent a cloud of grit and debris rattling against the adobe walls. Then the sound began, a low moan at first. It quickly grew into a deafening, shrieking roar, a physical force that vibrated through the floorboards and made the very air tremble. The world outside the windows vanished, replaced by a churning, opaque wall of red dust. It was a haboob, a great wave of sand rolling across the plains, swallowing everything in its path. Inside the house, the lamps flickered as the fine dust found its way through every crack and crevice, coating everything in a gritty film. Then, above the roar of the wind, they heard a new sound, a low rumble that grew in intensity until it was a thunderous, earth-shaking percussion. "Stampede!" Wade yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm. He was already moving, grabbing a wet bandana from a bucket Tia Rosa had prepared and tying it over his nose and mouth. The others followed suit, their eyes wide and grim in the flickering lamplight. There was no need for discussion, no time for a plan. There was only the roar of the storm and the thunder of 10,000 hooves. They burst out of the house into chaos. The air was a suffocating, sandpaper whirlwind. Visibility was almost zero. The world reduced to the swirling vortex of sand illuminated by the faint, ghostly glow of the lantern still hanging on the barn. The herd, a single, panicked entity, was a tidal wave of horn and hide, a dark river of terror flowing through the heart of the ranch. The arroyo, Wade shouted, his voice ripped away by the wind. "They are heading for the Arroyo Diablo." The deep, jagged chasm was less than a mile from the pasture, a sheer drop into darkness. If the herd went over, the ranch would not just be ruined, it would be utterly destroyed. Their entire future was thundering toward a cliff edge. Zeke was already on his horse, a dark shape in the maelstrom. Tomas, his small face pale but determined, was right behind him. Wade swung onto Apollo's back, his big horse already dancing with fear. He saw Izzy, a blur of motion, vault onto her own mount. For a moment their eyes met across the churning chaos, a shared understanding passing between them. This was a battle against nature itself, and they were all that stood between survival and annihilation. They rode into the stampede not as individuals, but as a single, desperate unit. They formed a V with Wade at the point, their goal not to stop the herd that was impossible, but to bend its momentum, to turn the terrified river of cattle away from the abyss. It was a nightmare of instinct and raw courage. They were swallowed by the herd, becoming part of the chaos. The air was thick with the smell of panicked animals and the sting of sand. Wade could feel the ground shuddering beneath Apollo's hooves. He could hear the frantic clattering of horns and the primal terror in the air. The tiny, insistent ringing of a lead cow's bell was a pathetic sound, lost in the overwhelming roar. They leaned into the heaving flank of the herd, pushing, yelling, their voices raw. Zeke, on the right flank, fired his pistol into the air, the flashes of light momentarily illuminating the terrifying scene. Tomas, his youth forgotten, rode like a seasoned drover, his small frame a testament to pure grit. Izzy was on the left, a phantom in the dust, her movements fluid and fearless. She rode as if she were part of her horse, weaving through the panicked animals, her presence a constant, steady pressure on the edge of the herd. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, their desperate effort began to work. The head of the stampede began to turn, veering away from the straight path to destruction. They were winning, and then disaster struck. Izzy's horse, its footing unsure in a washout hidden by the swirling dust, stumbled. It went down with a terrified scream, sending Izzy tumbling from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, a small, fragile thing in the path of the oncoming tide of trampling hooves. Wade saw it happen. The world seemed to slow down, the roar of the storm and the herd fading to a distant hum. He saw her, a flash of gray in the churning darkness, directly in the path of the relentless, unstoppable mass of cattle. He did not think. He reacted. His fear for the ranch, for his legacy, was burned away by a much more potent, much more terrifying fear. He spurred Apollo, angling the big horse like a lance, cutting back against the flow of the stampede. He yelled her name, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the storm. He reached her just as the first of the cattle were upon them. He brought Apollo around, putting his horse's body between her and the stampede, a desperate living shield. He leaned down, his arm outstretched, his fingers brushing her shoulder. "Izzy, take my hand." She was dazed, the breath knocked from her lungs, but her survival instincts were intact. She looked up, saw his face, and reached. He caught her hand, his grip like iron. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he hauled her up, pulling her from the ground and onto the saddle in front of him just as the full weight of the herd thundered past the spot where she had lain. They were pressed against the heaving, sweating bodies of the cattle, Apollo groaning with the effort of holding his ground. But they were alive. The rest of the night was a blur. They worked until their muscles screamed and their throats were raw, until the storm finally, mercifully, began to break. As the wind died down and the dust began to settle, a bruised dawn revealed the devastation. The fences were gone, the yard was a ruin, and a portion of the herd had been lost, scattered to the four winds. But they had done it. The bulk of the herd, including their vital breeding stock, was safe, huddled and trembling in a wide basin miles from the arroyo's edge. They had saved the heart of the ranch. They sat on their exhausted horses, four silent figures in the gray light, covered in a thick paste of mud and sweat. The world was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the weary breathing of the horses and the lowing of the cattle. Later, back at the ruined ranch house, as Tia Rosa tended to their cuts and scrapes, Wade and Izzy found themselves alone by the broken corral. They were too tired to speak, their bodies aching with a profound exhaustion. They just stood there, watching the sun rise on their battered world. "I have always been afraid," Wade said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Not of storms or drought, not really. I was afraid of losing this place because it was all I had left of them, of my parents." He looked at her, his eyes clear and stripped of all pretense. "Tonight, when I saw you fall, I realized I was not afraid of losing the ranch anymore. I was afraid of losing the people in it. I was afraid of being alone again." Izzy looked away, toward the mesas that were her home, her own defenses, so carefully constructed over the years, felt as battered as the landscape around them. "I am not afraid of being alone," she said softly. "I am afraid of not being alone. I am afraid of being caged. My mother made a promise that got her killed. I promised myself I would never be trapped like that I would always be free." She met his gaze, her own vulnerability a raw, open wound. "Tonight, when the herd was coming, I was not afraid of dying. I was afraid of you dying to save me, because then I would owe you a debt. I would be tied to you. I would not be free." They stood there in the quiet dawn, their deepest fears laid bare, his fear of losing people, her fear of being bound to them, two sides of the same lonely coin. A small, weary smile touched Wade's lips. He coughed, his lungs still full of dust. "You saved the whole ranch," he said, "and my stubborn hide along with it." A flicker of her old, wry humor returned to Izzy's eyes. "Do not waste it. You have still got to apologize to the well tomorrow." A fragile warmth spread between them, a truce born of shared terror and survival. But as Wade surveyed the damage, a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. Something was wrong. He walked into the house, into his small office where he kept his records. The door had been splintered, forced open. The desk had been ransacked, and the thick, leather-bound ledger, the book that contained the registration and brand records for every single animal on the Ashford Ranch, the ranch's legal identity, its proof of ownership, was gone. In the chaos of the storm, while they had been fighting for their very lives, another enemy had struck. Caleb Dorn had used the cover of nature's fury to deliver a potentially fatal blow, stealing the one thing they needed to legally prove their claim to the cattle they had just saved. The dawn that followed the discovery of the theft was a silent, wounded thing. The air was washed clean of dust, but the landscape was a portrait of desolation. A profound despair had settled over the ranch, heavier and more suffocating than the storm's sand. The loss of the ledger was a more crippling blow than the stampede. The cattle they had risked their lives to save were now, in the eyes of the law, nothing more than unregistered livestock, vulnerable to seizure by the first man with a plausible claim, a claim Royce Harlan would undoubtedly manufacture. Wade was in the yard, the rising sun casting his long shadow across the broken ground. He was methodically repairing the main gate, which had been splintered by the stampeding herd. His movements were stiff, automatic. The rhythmic tap of his hammer against the wood was the only sound, a small, futile act of imposing order on a world that had descended into chaos. He was not just fixing a gate, he was trying to rebuild the walls of his own shattered resolve. Each nail he drove was an act of defiance against the hopelessness that threatened to consume him. Inside the quiet kitchen, Izzy watched him through the window. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the weary set of his jaw. She had seen him face down rustlers, bankers, and a force of nature. But this quiet, methodical despair was something new. It was the look of a man who was truly and completely beaten. She turned away from the window. On the counter was a small, nearly empty sack of flour. Tia Rosa had set it aside, calling it their last reserve. Izzy ran her fingers through the fine, white powder. It was not enough for a loaf of bread, not enough for a proper meal. It was just enough for one last gesture. With a focused, almost ceremonial grace, she began to work. She added a pinch of salt, a little lard, and the last of the brackish water from the barrel. Her hands, so accustomed to the heft of a rifle or the reins of a horse, moved with a surprising deftness, kneading the simple dough on a floured board. She was not Tia Rosa. Her biscuits would not be light or fluffy. They would be what she was: resilient, unadorned, and made to endure. As the small, imperfect rounds of dough baked in the cast-iron oven, filling the small kitchen with the warm, honest smell of bread, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She had spent her life running from cages, from promises, from any bond that might cost her the wild freedom that was her inheritance. But watching Wade hammer that gate, seeing him refuse to surrender even in the face of utter defeat, she understood something profound. Freedom was not the absence of connection. It was the power to choose it. A cage was something you were forced into. A home, a partnership, was something you built, nail by nail, biscuit by biscuit. When they were done, golden brown, and smelling of hope, she placed them in a small basket lined with a clean cloth. She walked out into the red dust of the yard, the rising sun warm on her face. Wade did not hear her approach over the sound of his own work. He was bent over the gate, his focus absolute. She stopped a few feet away from him. He finally sensed her presence and straightened up. Turning to face her, his eyes were hollow with exhaustion. He looked at the basket in her hands, a question in his gaze. She set the basket down carefully on a flat-topped fence post. The morning air was still, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. but carried with an unshakable firmness that cut through his despair. The cattle baron needed a tamed bride, she said, her eyes locked on his. She paused, letting the words hang between them, an echo of the lie that had brought them together. Then she gave him the truth that would bind them. The wild virgin brought biscuits, and his lifetime says yes. It was not a question, it was a statement, a vow. It was everything she had to offer her wildness, her heart, her future. It was her answer to a question he had never truly asked, the answer to the unspoken contract that had formed between them in the heart of the storm. Her lifetime, offered to his. Her answer was yes. Wade stared at her, the hammer hanging forgotten in his hand. He understood. He heard the promise beneath the strange, poetic words. He saw the truth of it in her clear, steady gaze. She was not submitting to a role. She was choosing a partner. She was not being tamed. She was choosing to build a life with him, on their own terms. All the complexities of their situation, the legal papers, the corrupt judges, the stolen ledger, all of it fell away. All that was left was this moment, this offering, this simple, profound truth. He did not answer with a speech. Words were inadequate for what he felt. He let the hammer fall silently into the dust. He took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing in front of her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take one of the warm biscuits from the basket. He looked at it, then back at her. "Yes," he said. The word was a quiet breath, an exhalation of all his fear and loneliness. It was an acceptance, a promise, a vow of his own. He closed the remaining space between them and wrapped his arms around her. He held her not with desperation, but with a deep, grounding certainty. She was solid and real in his arms, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread clinging to her. He felt her arms go around his own waist, her hands pressing against the small of his back, holding him with a strength that matched his own. In the dust and the early morning light, surrounded by the wreckage of their ranch, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of consecration. It was slow and sure, a silent sealing of the lifetime of yeses that stretched before them. The kiss changed everything. When they finally broke apart, the despair in the air had been replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. They were no longer a cattle baron and a wild girl caught in a scheme. They were partners, and partners did not surrender. They planned. They gathered in the kitchen. The four of them, Wade, Izzy, Zeke, and Tia Rosa, with young Tomas watching from the doorway. The stolen ledger lay like a ghost at the center of the table. "Harlan has us," Zeke said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "Without that book, those are just stray cattle. He can put his own brand on them and claim them as his, and Judge Pike will sign the paper." "No," Wade said. The hollowness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hard, calculating light. "He does not have us. Not yet." He looked at Zeke. "Every cattleman has a brand, but every smart cattleman has something else, something the rustlers do not always look for." He walked to the hearth and took down a small, sharp knife used for whittling. "My father taught me, every calf we kept for breeding, every one of our prime stock, got a unique ear notch when it was branded, a specific cut, different for each year. It is a second ledger, a living one, carved into the herd itself." A spark of understanding lit Zeke's eyes. "The triangle notch, for this year's calves." "Exactly," Wade said. "We can round up the breeding stock. We can prove they are ours, one by one. It will be our word against Harlan's, but it is a start." "It is more than a start," Izzy said, her voice sharp with strategic thought. "Your word alone is not enough in Pike's court, but what about the word of 10 others?" She looked around the table. "You gave away your water. Wade, you shared what you had when you had nothing. The Hastings family, the Garcias, Old Man Hemlock, they all saw your brand on those cattle. They will remember. They can testify to which animals are yours." Tia Rosa nodded, a fierce pride on her face. "They will stand with us. An army of the poor is still an army. And we have the water, Izzy continued, her mind racing. Harlan's theft of the water is the root of all this. I will go find Naya. She knows the path of that underground river better than anyone. She can draw a map, a true one, that shows how it flows directly to your well. We can prove the dam was a deliberate act of theft. The energy in the room had shifted from mourning to mobilization. They had a plan, a three-pronged attack forged from their combined knowledge and experience, Wade's cattleman's cunning, Izzy's community ties, and the land's own secrets. Just then, Deputy Nora Briggs rode into the yard. She came into the kitchen, her face set in grim lines, but her eyes held a glint of something that was not despair. She listened as they laid out their plan. It is a good plan, she said when they had finished, but it will never work. Not as long as Judge Pike is on the bench. He will dismiss your ear notches as irrelevant, your witnesses as liars, and your map as a fabrication. Harlan owns the court. The hope in the room sagged. Nora let the silence hang for a moment before she played her ace. But Harlan does not own the United States government, she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. I have been reading the original territory survey maps all morning. The ones filed in Santa Fe, the southeast corner of your public grazing lease, Wade, borders a section line that was marked with a federal survey monument, a small iron post driven into the ground in 1872. She let that sink in. According to Jebediah Smith's confession, Caleb Dorn used that exact corner of the pasture to hold your stolen cattle before moving them. He even tied his horse to the federal marker. She looked Wade right in the eye. That means when Dorn stole your ledger, he was not just a common thief. He was committing a crime on federal jurisdiction. Stealing property related to a federal boundary makes this a federal matter. It moves the case out of Judge Pike's grubby hands and into the authority of a United States Marshal. A stunned silence filled the kitchen. It was a brilliant legal maneuver, a way to cut the legs out from under Harlan's corrupt local empire. Nora continued, her voice crisp and authoritative. I am sending a wire to the Marshal's office in Santa Fe. With Smith's signed confession and this jurisdictional hook, they will have to send someone. We are going to put Harlan and Dorn on trial not just for stealing your ranch, but for breaking federal law. The despair was gone. In its place was a hard, cold, and exhilarating hope. They had a plan, they had a community, and now they had the law, the real law, on their side. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like a fight they could win. Wade looked at Izzy, and she met his gaze. A shared, silent promise passing between them. The cattle baron and the wild virgin were ready for war. The U.S. Marshal, a tall, quiet man named Elias Thorne, arrived with the sunrise, bringing with him a federal judge whose name was Abraham Stern. Judge Stern was a circuit judge, a man whose courtroom was wherever he set his hat, and his face was etched with the kind of weary gravity that comes from seeing every brand of human folly the territory had to offer. The trial was convened not in Judge Pike's compromised courtroom, but in the town's simple meeting hall, its doors thrown open to the dusty street and the anxious faces of the entire community. The hall was packed. The small ranchers and homesteaders Wade had shared his water with stood shoulder to shoulder at the back, their presence a silent, powerful testimony. Royce Harlan and Judge Pike sat at a table near the front, their usual arrogance replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. They looked like men who had suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a river they had thought they controlled. The proceedings began with a stark, brutal efficiency that was the hallmark of federal justice. Deputy Nora Briggs was called first. She presented Jebediah Smith's signed confession, and Judge Stern read it aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as the full scope of Harlan's conspiracy was laid bare, the deliberate rustling, the manipulation of the county board, the creation of the virtue clause itself, all designed for the sole purpose of stealing the Ashford Ranch. Next, Nora presented Naya's map. It was drawn on a piece of cured deerskin, the lines showing the secret path of the underground river rendered with an artist's precision. Izzy was called to testify. She stood before the judge, not in a borrowed dress, but in her own practical trousers and shirt. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, explaining how the map was made, how the water flowed, and how the dam had starved the land. Harlan objected, calling it folk nonsense, but Judge Stern silenced him with a single, icy glare. Finally, Wade was called. He did not bring a ledger. Instead, with Zeke and Thomas's help, he brought the proof itself. They led one of his prize heifers to the open doorway of the hall. The animal was nervous, its eyes rolling, but Wade soothed it with a low murmur and a steady hand. He pointed to the small, triangular notch in the animal's ear. "This is the Ashford mark for this year's breeding stock," Wade explained, his voice ringing with authority. "Every rancher here knows my brand, but this mark is my private ledger. It proves this animal was born and raised on my land, Mr. Harlan claims ownership of my herd, yet I doubt he can produce a single animal with this mark. One by one, other ranchers, Mr. Garcia, the Hastings patriarch." Old Man Hemlock stepped forward to confirm they recognized the brand and had seen the mark on Ashford cattle for years. The community's quiet support had found its voice. The case against Harlan and Pike was no longer just a collection of documents. It was a living, breathing testament of a people united against tyranny. Royce Harlan's face was pale with sweat. Judge Pike fidgeted with his collar, his face a blotchy red. Judge Stern looked down at them from his makeshift bench, his expression one of profound contempt. He picked up his gavel, the simple block of wood suddenly feeling like the weight of destiny. "In light of this testimony," Judge Stern began, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "this court finds that there is overwhelming—" He never finished the sentence. A gunshot exploded from the street outside, shattering a window and sending a shower of glass across the floor. Pandemonium erupted. People screamed and dove for cover, overturning benches and scrambling for the exits. Caleb Dorn and 3 of his men were in the street, guns drawn, their face twisted with violent desperation. They were not there to win a legal argument. They were there to burn the whole world down. But they had not counted on the defenders of that world being ready. Even as the first shot was fired, a plan, unspoken but perfectly understood, snapped into place. Izzy was already gone. She had slipped out of the hall moments before the verdict, her instincts screaming that the quiet was a lie. She was not in the street. She was across the way, scaling the ladder to the church's bell tower, her rifle slung over her back. She had always known that the best way to win a fight was from high ground. In the street, Nora Briggs moved with the lethal grace of a professional. She kicked over a water trough, using it as cover as she drew her service revolver. "Marshal." With me, she yelled to Elias Thorne, who was already moving to flank Dorn's men. Zeke, his good arm holding an old shotgun, positioned himself in the doorway of the meeting hall, a grizzled, unmovable guardian. "Thomas, get down," he roared. Harlan saw his chance. In the swirling chaos, he made a break for it, scrambling out a back window, his dignity forgotten in a panicked bid for escape. Wade saw him go. A primal rage, hot and fierce, surged through him. He could end this. He could run Harlan down and deliver the justice the land itself was crying out for. But as he started to move, his eyes met Izzy's for a split second. She was a silhouette in the open arch of the bell tower, a hawk in its nest, and in that fleeting glance, he saw not a killer, but a protector. He remembered their partnership, their shared belief in a justice they had to build themselves. He did not go after Harlan with a gun. He went after him with the law on his heels. "Marshal, he is getting away," Wade shouted, his voice a clear command that cut through the noise. The battle in the street was short and brutal. Dorn, a wild animal cornered, raised his pistol to fire at Nora. Before he could pull the trigger, Nora's own gun bucked in her hand. Her shot was a marvel of precision. It did not hit Dorn's chest or his head. It struck his right hand, shattering the bone and sending his pistol clattering into the dust. He howled, clutching his ruined hand, his fight suddenly over. At the same moment, the sharp, authoritative crack of a rifle echoed from the bell tower. One of Dorn's men, aiming at the marshal, suddenly found his hat spun from his head. A second shot kicked up a fountain of dust an inch from the boot of another, causing him to yelp and drop his gun as if it were a hot coal. Izzy was not firing to kill. She was firing to command. Her shots were punctuation marks in a violent sentence. Her skill so absolute it was terrifying. She had them pinned, disarmed, and demoralized in seconds. Wade caught up to Harlan in the alley behind the meeting hall. The banker was scrambling over a pile of crates, his fine suit torn, his face a mask of pathetic terror. Wade did not draw his weapon. He simply grabbed Harlan by the collar and hauled him back, slamming him against the adobe wall. For a moment, Wade's hands went to Harlan's throat, his thumbs pressing against the man's windpipe. He saw the flash of fear in Harlan's eyes, and he felt the satisfying, terrible surge of power. He could end it all right here. But he thought of the biscuit in the dusty yard. He thought of the word is. This was not the justice he had promised to build with her. He released his grip, and instead pinned Harlan's arms behind his back. "It is over. Royce," Wade said, his voice cold and final. "You will face the law." The gunfire stopped. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by Dorn's whimpering and the ragged breathing of the townsfolk emerging from cover. And then a new sound began, clear and strong. The old iron bell in the church tower began to ring. Bong, bong, bong. It was not a frantic alarm, but a steady, resonant peal. Young Tomas, who had taken refuge in the church, was pulling the rope. His small act a declaration that the fear was over. The sound washed over the dusty street, a promise of a new, cleaner beginning. Marshal Thorne and Nora secured Dorn and his men. Wade marched a trembling Royce Harlan out of the alley and handed him over. Judge Stern stepped out of the hall, his face like thunder. He surveyed the scene, the disarmed rustlers, the captured banker, the silent, watchful woman in the bell tower. He did not bother to reconvene the court. He delivered his verdict right there, in the middle of the street, his voice carrying to every corner of the town square. "The virtue clause of the Mesquite-Ford County Charter is hereby declared null and void, an instrument of fraud," he announced. "Wade Ashford's grazing rights are fully and immediately restored. The dam on the water source is to be dismantled, and the reservoir created by Royce Harlan is seized as public property, to be managed by the town for the common good." He pointed a stern finger at the disgraced Judge Pike. "And I am recommending your immediate removal from the bench pending a federal investigation." Justice had not come quietly. It had come in a storm of dust and a volley of gunfire. But as the bell continued to ring, a deep, collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the people of Mesquite Ford. The long drought, the one of man's making, was finally over. Wade looked up at the bell tower, and though he could not see her face clearly, he knew Izzy was looking back at him. They had won, not just with guns, but with community, with courage, and with a trust they had forged in the heart of the fire. A week after the trial, the sky broke. It did not come with the violence of the dust storm, but with a gentle, hesitant grace. The clouds, which had been a distant, mocking white for months, gathered and grayed, heavy with a promise the land had almost forgotten how to believe in. The first drop of rain fell on the dusty porch step with a soft hiss, leaving a dark, star-shaped mark. Then another fell, and another, until the air was filled with a steady, vertical drumming. A collective sigh seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The cracked ground, baked hard as pottery, drank in the moisture, its fissures darkening as the water sank deep into its thirsty heart. The scent of rain on dry earth, a perfume of ozone and wet dust and creosote, rose up and filled the world. In the town, children who had known only a world of grit and heat ran out into the street, their faces turned up to the sky, their mouths open to catch the clean, cool drops, Their laughter was a sound more precious than gold. The rain was a baptism. It washed the dust from the leaves of the cottonwoods, turning them a vibrant green. It filled the ruts in the road, creating miniature, muddy rivers. It soaked the timbers of the Ashford ranch house, darkening the wood and washing away the last stains of the storm. It was an absolution, a sign that the long season of hardship was truly over. In the months that followed, the changes in Mesquite Ford were as profound as the greening of the land. The community, forged in the crucible of shared adversity, did not fracture with the return of prosperity. It grew stronger. Izzy, who had once lived at the edge of the world, found herself at its center. One afternoon, seeing Tomas struggling to read a notice nailed to the general store, she sat him down on a barrel and began tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. Other children, drawn by curiosity, gathered around. Soon, the women came too, their faces shy but their eyes hungry for knowledge. And so, the Mesquite Ford School was born. Not in a formal building, but in the shade of the barn, with a piece of slate for a blackboard and a woman in canvas trousers for a teacher. She taught them letters and numbers, but she also taught them how to read the clouds and how to find north by the stars. Her own brand of practical, essential wisdom. Wade, for his part, became a different kind of cattle baron. The first thing he did with the bank loan he secured from Santa Fe, a loan based not on virtue clauses, but on the proven value of his herd, was to build a new, larger windmill. He did not place it over his own well. He erected it on a rise between his land and his neighbors, a towering symbol of a new era. Its spinning blades pumped clean, abundant water into a long stone trough, a source of life freely available to anyone who needed it. No questions asked. He had learned the hard way that a man's strength was not measured by the height of his fences, but by the reach of his generosity. The wheels of formal justice turned slowly, but they turned true. Marshal Thorne escorted Royce Harlan away in shackles, his face a mask of disbelief. A man undone by the very community he had sought to plunder. Caleb Dorn and his men were sentenced to a long stretch of hard labor in a federal prison, and Judge Luther Pike, facing disgrace and federal charges, quietly resigned and vanished from the territory, leaving behind nothing but the sour memory of his corruption. The town, given a chance to choose its own future, chose wisely. In a special election, they made Nora Briggs their new sheriff, her tin star a symbol not of brute force, but of sharp, incorruptible integrity. Zeke Holt, his arm fully healed, used his share of a reward posted by the marshal to expand his blacksmith shop, the ring of his hammer a constant, steady heartbeat in the center of town. Young Thomas, his grit and loyalty proven beyond doubt, was made Wade's foreman, his quiet pride in his new role a pleasure to behold. And Naya, respected for her wisdom and integrity, became the official trade representative for her people, ensuring that the commerce between the dine and the town was conducted with fairness and mutual respect. A bridge between two worlds, Queen. One evening in late autumn, when the air was crisp and the sky was the color of a perfect turquoise stone, Wade and Izzy held a second wedding. There was no preacher, no congregation, and no legal document. The only witnesses were Tia Rosa, Zeke, and Tomas, gathered on the front porch of the ranch house. Wade stood before Izzy. He was not wearing a suit, but his everyday work clothes, clean and comfortable. Izzy wore a simple blue dress Tia Rosa had helped her sew, a color that matched the sky. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged promises, their voices quiet in the golden, late afternoon light. "I will mend the fences with you," Wade said, his eyes holding hers. "I will ride into the storms with you. I will share my coffee with you, and my silence." Izzy smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "I will share the last of the flour with you," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "I will stand the night watch with you. I will share the water, and the sun, and the long, hard days." It was all they needed. Tia Rosa wiped a tear from her eye with the corner of her apron. Zeke cleared his throat, his gruff exterior failing to hide his deep affection. They were not just man and wife. They were partners, their union forged not by law, but by fire and dust, and a shared, stubborn will to survive. Later, as twilight settled over the valley, casting long, peaceful shadows, they sat together on the top step of the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the rich, loamy smell of the healing earth. From the kitchen behind them came the warm, comforting aroma of freshly baked biscuits. In the nearby pasture, the cattle breathed, a soft, contented sound, their bellies full of rich grass. The world was at peace. Wade leaned back against a porch post, his arm resting comfortably behind her shoulders. He watched the first stars begin to prick the deep purple of the sky. "I thought I needed a tamed bride," he said, his voice a low, reflective murmur. Izzy leaned her head against his shoulder. A small smile played on her lips. "You needed a partner," she said. Wade looked down at her, at the wild, beautiful, and fiercely loyal woman who had saved him in more ways than he could count. He felt a wave of gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. He had started this journey seeking a contract to save his land. He had found a covenant that saved his soul. "And I said yes," he said. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.